Hi class. So this lecture, I'm going to go over the first three poems of this unit. They're imagist poems and really easy to break down, really short. I'm really going to be going over how to annotate your poems throughout this class and really how to analyze them. So let me go ahead and turn to Canvas. Okay, so we're going to go over Ezra Pound's In a Station of the Metro, Williams, Carlos Williams, The Red Wheelbarrow, and This Is Just to Say. So, in a station of the metro. So, the first thing you want to do when you look at poems is you want to number all the lines. You want to do this every time you really look at a poem. So, I'm going to change the color of what I'm using to highlight so that I can, see kind of my annotations. So, I'm going to put one there because that's line one. I'm going to put a two there for line two. Then I want to go through the poem line by line and really kind of, if there's words I don't understand or things that pop up to me, I want to put them in there. This is how you're going to turn in, your quizzes throughout the semester. And really when you're doing your reading responses, you want to do this with those poems too. Okay, so the first thing I notice is the apparition, right? I might not know what that word is. In fact, when I first read this poem, I didn't know what that was. It's a ghost, basically. Or it's ghostly, right? Ghost-like. And then petals on a wet black bough. So bough is an old word for like a tree limb or branch, really. I'm just going to put branch because that's the more common term. Okay. And you want to do this with every poem you go through. It just is going to help you. Okay, so if I was going to look at this from a new critical perspective, right, the one that we kind of talked about in the last lecture where it's just the text, that's all we're using to interpret, right? So the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. So obviously the time of year is probably winter because the tree is wet, right? So it's been raining. So it's either, spring or fall or winter. It's a time when it's raining and cold, all right? And these faces in the crowd are ghost-like. Okay, I don't have much to go on, right? Like that's about it. This is weird. I look at the title, right, and it's in a station of the metro. So a metro is essentially like a subway station, kind of like BART or Caltrans or Muni, whatever you've been used to taking, right, wherever you are. And so why is he talking about petals on a tree when the title is something about a metro station? So that's interesting, right? So we want to start to do some digging. And here's where we really have to start looking at historical and cultural context, right? I did include a picture of a tree with some petals on it, right? Which is really beautiful. But, there's got to be more to this poem than just a pretty picture, yes? So I'm really looking at also the time period in which it was written. It was written in the 1926, right? In London, by the way. And this period of time is post-industrial revolution. So I Googled images of London in the 1920s, and this is what came up. And, just to bring a modern context, I don't know how many of you have ever, gone on the subway, ridden Muni or BART or whatever your train or system of public transportation is. But in the winter, right, when I have looked around, usually there's a lot of people in coats. They're bundled up. They're not really talking. They're kind of keeping to themselves. Nowadays, people would be on their phones. And so it's just images of these people just kind of waiting, right? Waiting to go to work, waiting to start their day. And when we think about London in the 1920s, right, industrial revolution, everyone's working, everyone is, we're going into a factory or going to an office, right? People are dressed in dark clothing. They have coats on. Back then they wore hats. That was a normal thing. And so just looking at these images, right, these people crossing this bridge in London, people in these crowded streets, really along the kind of taxiway here, it is they're kind of just faces in a crowd, right? Kind of like ghost-like, apparition-like, just a moment of life, right? That's to be taken. And there's something about the Industrial Revolution in which, these workers were just one of many, the cog in the machine. And so that makes this poem take on a whole other meaning. So that's just one way that you could look at this poem. There's other ways, but really what I look at is, again, these faces in the crowd, right? Like these people, right? And like London in the 1920s, you want to think about soot, coal, ambition, right? And industry, steel, like all this stuff. Like, again, these beautiful apparitions, these ghost-like figures on this very wet black background. It's comparing these kinds of people to these petals. And also, if you think about the petals on the branch, right? If they're stuck to the branch, it means they're no longer alive. They've fallen off the tree. And so their existence is for this one beautiful moment and then kind of gone. So again, this whole poem takes on a completely different perspective when you start to think about the other parts of context. Okay, let's move on to another one. Okay, the red wheelbarrow. So again, when you're starting, you want to number, right, all of the lines. So this would be line 1. This is line 2, 3, 4, and the white, just need that. 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so let me go ahead and read it. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater besides the white chickens. Also, by the way, aside from lines, you notice that there's these little sections of poem kind of separated by big space, very much like a paragraph, right? So in poetry speak, or in terms, we call this a stanza. It's kind of like a paragraph, but we call it stanza in poetry terms. So this would be stanza 1. This is stanza 2. This is stanza 3, and this is stanza 4. So this poem has 8 lines with 4 stanzas, okay? I don't really need to define any of these. I know what all these terms mean. If we're looking at this from, just a new critical perspective, it's just some images, right? So we've got, I found this on the internet, we've got a red wheelbarrow with some chickens. And the wheelbarrow is a little glazed with rain. Again, right, rain, wetness, right? Again, just thinking about the terms. So if we were going to look at this from a new critical perspective and just take it for what it is, right, the words on the page, really it's just describing a beautiful picture of farm life, or the pastoral, as they say. But again, I'm not satisfied with that. There is more to this poem than just some pretty picture of a farm, right? And one of the keys that you know that is this first stanza. So much depends upon, right? The barrow, the rain, the chickens, right? I mean, there's something important about these things, right? And it's not just because they're pretty. So again, I start to think about the time period, and I think about farming, right? In the rural life, really. And so I pulled up these pictures. This is something from the 1960s. And if you read the kind of picket signs, it's a lot about, crop damage, striking, farm workers really have had a gigantic struggle in the United States, especially after the Dust Bowl era. And, on the right here is a picture, an image of a family of farmers from the 1930s. As you can see, like, it's pretty desolate, right? They're pretty thin. It might seem like they're struggling, right? A lot of farmers do struggle, right? Crops are so dependent on things like rain, right? On the equipment you use, the chickens that you need to produce the eggs, and, so on and so forth. So really, it's so much more than just a pretty picture. This poem is really describing how these simple things are not so simple. They're so significant for a farmer, right? They're so important and imperative for their survival. And that's what takes this poem from just this pretty image to so much more historical and cultural context. So that's why you always want to dig a little deeper. Okay, let's look at the last one. Okay, so this is William Carlos Williams' This Is Just to Say. And again, you want to number all your lines. 1, 2, 3. I'm going to not color these because it takes too long. And if you want to skip that, that's fine too. But you definitely want to number all your lines, because when you're citing them in any essay, you want to be able to cite the lines that you are referring to. So just for reference, this poem has 12 lines. and 1, 2, 3 stanzas. And again, a stanza kind of looks like just a paragraph. It's a cluster of lines that are separated by space, just like a paragraph, right? So, okay, I'm going to go ahead and read it. I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. Okay, so again, new imagist, right? Here's this picture. A picture of a juicy plum, right? This is really the thing that they want you to think about, the new critics at least. But again, we know that there's so much more to this poem than just a juicy plum. You really want to think about deeper meaning. So if I was going to go stanza by stanza, right? The first one is, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox. So what I think about is things like guilt, right? Things like giving into temptation, giving into desire, right? And then the second stanza is really about, this person was saving them, right? They were kind of something that they were treasuring, right? And this person ate them and indulged. And then the last lines, you really want to read them out loud to yourself. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. So you'll notice that when you say these lines out loud, your tongue will start to water. There's something about the words and the syllables that will make the mouth kind of water up. And again, like indulgence, pleasure, right? There's so much more to this poem than just eat your plums. And I mean, what if I told you this poem was actually about desire or pleasure or need or even something sexual? We do know that William Carlos Williams was a closeted gay man. So he did put a lot of sexual references in his poetry. And then if you think about that, it takes on a completely different meaning, right? And, also like almost all poetry goes back to biblical references. And so we know that, in the Garden of Eden, there was the apple, right? And so in this case, he's talking about the plum, right? It's a completely different reference, but it kind of harkens back to the Bible and desire and temptation, right? Pleasure, all these things that are kind of taboo. And in that way, this poem takes on a completely different meaning. Okay, so I hope I've helped you kind of dive into how you're going to annotate and how you're going to interpret some of these poems. I know that it seems complicated at first. Poetry was really hard for me when I first started reading it, but once someone showed me a way in, it was really liberating because I feel like I can pretty much break down anything. That's why we start with poetry. It's the most complicated, but once you get through it, I think all of the other things we're going to be reading this semester will be much easier for you to dive into. Anyway, if you have any questions, let me know.